when we brought Erich Traub over here, now Richard Shope and all of those guys, they knew how intelligent Traub was, and they were, he could run circles around all of these Americans, and so we basically put that guy at the top of our biological warfare program. He was advising us on how to set up the biological warfare program. He was advising us on how to make Plum Island, how to build Plum Island.
All right, we are joined today by Adam A.W. Finnegan, and I use A.W. Finnegan because that is the author name on the book he has written, The Sleeper Agent, which is available on Amazon and pretty much everywhere that books are sold. I think it's a Trine Day book. How are you doing today, Adam?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming on, and I kind of feel blindsided a little bit because I used to be a runner. I trained for marathons, and one of the most famous runners out there, he goes to all the conventions and stuff. I forgot his name, but he had Lyme disease.
Mm-hmm.
And he's somebody who has really struggled through time with Lyme disease in being able to run and train and become a good athlete. But I've all of a sudden found out lately that Lyme disease may not actually be a natural phenomenon. And I believe your book goes into that.
Right. Yep.
What inspired you to explore this?
Actually, it was when I got sick in 2016. Eventually, I found I had Lyme disease, though they told the when I went to the regular physicians and using the CDC approved test, it said that I did not. I got a copy of it. And I was so after that, I had joined a group, a bunch of women that were kind of working on this stuff, and eventually they told me, okay, those tests are no good. You have to get, I think it was an IgX test, which the other doctors that are considered Lyme literate doctors give, which actually the CDC used to give that test apparently before 1994, but they changed everything in 1994. They changed the definition of Lyme, they changed the testing of Lyme, and eventually I found out that I did have it.
Is Lyme disease hard to detect?
Yeah, it can be. It can be very hard to detect in some people. In some people, there's a small percentage that will test positive on that test when they have it, but the large majority of them don't test positive even though they have it, and it has to do with something called HLA, which is your immune system makeup. Like there's different people have different immune systems. It's like a genetic thing, and there's a certain percentage of people that can test positive and they deal with it better. The people that test positive, they deal with the disease better. They're able to maintain themselves in a much I think they only get like a mild set of symptoms that is not very like debilitating. But then there is a large percentage that get this really nasty disease, that get really sick. And those are the people that tend to test negative, even though they will test positive on the test that the IgX test that I talked about that a lot of the Lyme literate doctors give. I know it's kind of confusing.
Well, let's back up. Can you describe exactly what Lyme disease is? Because a lot of people have heard the name, but what is it and what does it do?
Well, Lyme disease was the name for the disease. It was the name given to the disease caused by Borrelia burgdorferi, the spirochetes that are considered the what would you call the origin of Lyme disease. Now, So the spirochetes are like little worms, or they're classed as bacteria, but they look like little squiggly lines. These are the spirochetes. They almost look like little worms. Um, and there's different spirochetes. There's syphilis. That's part of the treponema group, and then there's leptospira, which is another spirochete. But Lyme disease is part of the class called Borrelia, and so a lot of people will get sick, really sick, and that is because of what the Lyme disease does to their immune system more than what the bacteria is doing to them. The bacteria likes to shed these nasty proteins into the bloodstream. Um, and a lot of times it will cause an immune deficiency. It will kind of knock out the immune system. And that's why a lot of those people get really, really sick. But then you have the small percentage of people that are able to deal with it a little better, and because of their immune system makeup. And that's the same reason why some people get really sick with COVID while some people won't have any symptoms. It's part of that whole HLA thing.
What
The
are the
makeup.
symptoms
Huh?
what are the symptoms of Lyme disease?
Um, Depending on the person, like for the people that have a good immune system, a lot of times they'll have like a swollen knee. But I think generally it's like fatigue, headaches. Um, I mean, for me, it was a whole different ballgame because I had that really nasty form where it kind of suppresses the immune system really badly. And that was like, I just remember I had these headaches that are like really strange, and it just feels like my head's being crushed in like a vice. And I was really tired. What else? I know that when it started, I was vomiting, but I think it's just like very general symptoms, only they're just really intense. So you get the chronic fatigue. I know I had that, like just bone crushing fatigue. They were just really intense. And they weren't, I don't know how to explain it, but they were kind of weird. Like sometimes it almost felt like my head was buzzing, like this weird feeling, this weird sensation. It's hard to describe, but I just remember that it was like nothing that I had ever been through before.
When was the first, I don't know, case of Lyme disease diagnosed?
So they basically shined all this light on it in, I think it was 1976. But people had been sick for a long time. Like there was a lot of people. For example, someone named Polly Murray. She was a woman who lived in that area of Lyme, Connecticut. She wrote a book actually. It was called The Widening Circle, and she lists the start of her illness. Or she lists that she got really sick in the summer of 1956. She talks about how by the 60s she was debilitated, and it wasn't until 1975 or 1976 that they started to acknowledge the disease because of a cluster of cases in children. But there's also papers from Alan Steer, one of the lead CDC researchers, or he worked for the CDC, and he worked for the EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence Services. He was publishing papers talking about how it was in Montauk as far back. Or actually, I forget where he was talking about where it was, but it may have been Massachusetts. But he was saying that it was there, it was present all the way back into the 60s, like in the early 60s. I think he may have said 1961 is the earliest. So it was definitely getting rolling in the 50s.
But all told, then it's relatively recent.
Yeah.
If we get
Right.
all human history, I mean, that's, syphilis has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? This is new.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So is that what
Well,
started people down the track wondering the origin and how it was created?
they weren't really that focused on it. They just thought it was a new disease. It was until when John Loftus, who was he worked for the Department of Justice. He was a Nazi hunter, you could say. His job was to find Nazi war criminals that were hiding in America after the war and prosecute them. And he had published a book in 1982 called The Belarus Secret. And in The Belarus Secret, he talked about how the Lyme disease outbreak in America, the Lyme disease epidemic, was started because of biological warfare experiments gone awry, thanks to this Nazi that we brought over here, who his name was Erich Traub. But he didn't name Traub in that book at that time. He just said a Nazi that was brought, and he said that the origins because of experiments that were being done on Plum Island.
When did Germany start experimenting with the biological warfare?
There was a bioterrorism campaign around 1914, 1915. They were going around infecting all of the horses around America, the medical and military horses, that is. And because they thought that we had sent cattle over to Germany that were deliberately infected with foot and mouth disease.
Okay, so wait a minute. The Germans were infecting U.S. Cattle and horses and whatnot, or livestock?
Well, what happened was Britain infected cattle that we were sending to Germany. We were trading with Germany and blamed it on us. Germany thought it was us, thought it was America that did it. And they're like, all right, they mounted this big bioterrorism campaign because it was in the years, well, this was like in the 1800s, the late 1800s, early 1900s, this happened. And that was the origin of their first biological warfare facility, which is called Insel Reims. It was because of this big foot and mouth disease epidemic that started in Germany. So by World War I, they had started this campaign, and they started going around infecting all of the horses in America.
Okay, how were they doing that? I mean,
yeah, they had like these saboteurs. There's a few books on it. They had a couple saboteurs, and they had a homegrown lab 6 miles from the White House with this guy named Anton Dilger. He was cooking up glanders, anthrax, and several other germs to be used, and so they would have it on like a needle that was in a little cork in a bottle, and they would go around and jab the animals.
Okay, so I'm curious, is this around the or similar to the Black Tom explosion? I know I'm going way out there, but
yeah, that was part of so it wasn't just bioterrorism. They also had explosives, a big sabotage campaign. So they would sabotage ships that were bringing ammo to allies and stuff. And so the biological terrorism campaign was just one aspect of it. So yes, that Black Tom incident, that was part of the sabotage campaign.
Okay, so we're talking about World War I here. Now we always have the association with World War II, obviously with Paperclip and all these things that went down. But you're saying this went back even further. It went the war prior.
Well, I was only talking about Germany's role. It goes back even further. I have on record in this book George Washington it's a quote where he's talking about the British using smallpox and deliberately infecting people and sending them out to the Continental Army to infect the army. And they also used smallpox against the Native Americans. They would take infected blankets, or they would take blankets from people that had smallpox and give it to the Native Americans, and they would all get sick. And they did this in America and in Australia at the very same time.
Okay, now I'm not sure. Again, I'm not expert. I had thought that the blankets weren't necessarily a good transport mechanism for smallpox.
Well, I have quotes where they were using blankets and they were giving it to him, and he's saying, "I hope it has the desired effect," and he billed the British Crown. So even if that didn't work out, they were trying to with the blankets, but they did find a way to get them because it killed off a lot of Native Americans, and they also did this in Australia, and they do have records saying that it was very successful. However they tried to do that.
Oh, it could be just sending people who were infected amongst them, and
exactly
potentially.
There's that too, but they realized the value of it by the 1700s. They were like, okay, disease is a really good way to kill people off, kill off our enemies. So I have most of that. Like, if I talk about any of that stuff, it's always with like quotes, kind of like George Washington. I have the quote where he's saying, the word is they're sending people out that have been inoculated with the smallpox, with the intention to spread it in our country, in our camp. But the sabotage campaign was like, this was one of the times that was really where Germany anyway got it rolling. And so they were not just infecting horses that were going to be pulling carts for the army. They were also infecting horses that were going to be used to turn out serums and vaccines.
That makes sense.
So it was intended for humans. It was like an indirect way to attack humans.
Okay, so this brings us forward to, I believe, World War II, and an individual that you wrote a lot about, Erich Traub, or Dr. Erich Traub. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly.
Yeah, no, you are.
And who is he?
He was an interesting and mysterious character that his name became more well known thanks to the book Lab 257, which that was Michael Carroll's book on Plum Island, and so that was really the first time his name became more widely known. He was a virologist. He was studying in what would be called filterable viruses, and he got a scholarship to go study at the Rockefeller Institute in the early 1930s. I think it was 1933 he was approved, and he was there by 1934. I think he may have even been there in 1933. Maybe he was approved in 1932. But he was there in the early 30s.
So we trained
to go
him?
study.
So the U.S. trained this individual?
Sort of. He started studying over in Germany first as a veterinary medicine and animal diseases. And then he was acting as an interpreter. Richard E. Shope was over there studying at University of Gießen in Germany, and Traub was acting as an interpreter because before he went into veterinary medicine, he went to school for language. He became fluent in English and to a lesser degree in French. And so Shope noticed that he had an exceptional talent in virology. He said, "You should come study at the Rockefeller Institute." But he came over to Rockefeller Institute and he started studying in virology, and he was under Richard Shope. He studied the Rockefeller Institute all the way up until 1938 before he went back to Germany. But he made a very interesting discovery that during his time with the Rockefeller Institute that became kind of the basis of his whole career in bioweaponeering. So while he was at the Rockefeller Institute, he was likely working in biological weapons, but they were calling it vaccine research.
Now, this was in Germany or here, or we're still pre-World
This is in the Rockefeller Institute. Okay. He was studying animal vaccines, and he made some interesting discoveries that would become his life work, and it was with this virus, which I will call for short LCM virus, which stands for lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus. And he discovered the virus in mice, although it was being discovered elsewhere almost simultaneously. And it was after he went to Iowa with Dr. Shope to study this disease called pseudo-rabies, which it's not rabies, but it causes a similar disease, which they called mad itch. It causes this kind of like frenzy in animals. It's a swine herpes virus, but it causes this raging disease that is similar to rabies in a way. But they couldn't figure out how it started, and they realized at the end that it was a virus that was dormant and had somehow been reactivated in the swine and became this nastier disease. And so he was like, okay, I wonder if other animals also have a virus in them that I could reawaken. Right? So he started these experiments with mice. And what he did was injected foreign proteins into the brain of mice. And then soon after that, it started an epidemic in the mouse colony. And it even got some of the animal caretakers sick. So it was this big epidemic going on in there. And they found that it was the virus lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus, or LCM virus. And so he realized he could start an epidemic from scratch with that virus. Then he studied it further, and it wasn't just like, it didn't just cause an epidemic and then go away. So these mice would remain chronically infected. And it was a really strange thing as generations came forth. Like, so the next batch of mice that would be born, they would all be infected too.
Oh, so it transferred in the DNA or genetically somehow?
Yep. It transferred, and it was, and it would be a what you would call congenital infection. And he noted that so anytime the mother was sick, she always invariably gave birth to infected mice. And so one of the strange things that he noticed was that the next batch of mice, they would be born and they would not have any antibodies to the virus, and they did not have noticeable signs of disease at first. So that kind of flips our entire idea. It kind of flips our entire paradigm of immunology on its head, first off. But then what he started to notice was that these mice, they would look healthy, but then, and they would sometimes for their whole life, but they would come down with these nasty neurological diseases. They would have all sorts of problems in their organs. It would be like a stealth disease, right? It would be like a stealth disease. And the next thing so they would have all of these strange chronic diseases and neurological disorders. And also what he noticed was that the cancer rate skyrockets. And he even noted, which I talked about later in my book, he even noted that in wild mice, he could raise the cancer rate to 50% with this new mechanism. And so this was like a form of immunodeficiency. It caused this immunodeficiency in the mice, and they would always have this chronic infection. So all of those mice, he would be able to get virus out of them, and he would be able to infect other mice that had not been part of that colony, right? So he was able to kind of verify that, yes, even though they don't have antibodies, even though these mice don't look sick, they're crawling with virus, and he's able to infect other colonies. And, the other colonies would get a noticeable disease because they weren't, these mice were born that way. And so it was almost, they were wondering, are they not showing signs because when they're born with it, it just notices the virus as part of itself since it's born that way. And so that became kind of like a big debate. But later on, this condition became known as immune tolerance. Excuse me. Immune tolerance was the term they gave it, although they would also call it by names like immune paralysis, which is a more apt name. They were wondering they were thinking that the virus, since they would not have any symptoms, if they were just kind of like tolerant to it, it would just tolerate the virus. Or was it doing harm? But they found out that it was actually more along the lines of a immune paralysis. The immune system was suppressed to such an extent, actively being suppressed, that it just couldn't fight back. It should be fighting back, but it couldn't fight back. And this became kind of like the blueprint that would have allowed us to figure out most chronic diseases, because most chronic diseases are the result of this immune deficiency. The immune system just doesn't work properly. And these antigens that were on LCM virus, he used these to start making bioweapons, on so many other, he could induce it with bacteria. And that's where the tick-borne diseases come into play. He learned so he went back to Germany. And by the way, the Rockefeller Institute, they were sending letters back and forth to each other saying, Erich Traub is the best student we have here. He thinks for himself. He's original. He's just, he's very intelligent. And he was kind of running circles around everybody else. And they said, he's the best student we have here. We should try to keep him here, blah, blah, blah. But he wanted to go back to Germany. His wife wasn't very happy here, and I guess she was the one who was supposedly so pro-Hitler. I guess he didn't really care much for politics. He just loved science. That's what the papers show anyway. But so he went back to Germany, and he started studying under a man named Karl Beller, who was a professor at the University of Gießen. And while he was under Beller, he was taught about how you could have. So this is where he got all of his expertise in tick-borne disease, under Karl Beller, the year 1939. There was a paper. So he was Karl Beller's assistant professor. So he was right under him, directly under him, and he taught Erich Traub how you could kind of induce the same condition by having many diseases, like many infections, all rolled into one, or like a tick that would infect something with many diseases. So, like today with Lyme disease, when people get bit by a black-legged tick, they don't usually get just Lyme disease. They get a whole bunch of different infections. They get the Lyme disease, but they also get babesiosis, which is a blood parasite that is similar to malaria. They get all these different rickettsia, which is a certain kind of bacteria that, typhus is part of the rickettsia group. And they get Bartonella, which is a nasty blood bacteria.
So ticks in essence will give you a disease cocktail?
Yes. Yep. A cocktail of disease, and he learned about all of those same diseases in 1939.
Okay, now this is when he's working in Germany, and at this point, is he actually working for the Nazis?
Not yet. He's under Professor Beller, but Beller would join the Nazis, and so he will join the Nazis. He joins the Nazi Party. Actually, no, he joined the Nazi Party, I believe, before he started with Beller, because he would say that in order to uh, be part of this, you had to join the Nazi Party. Um, but it may have been not in 1942 when he was drafted into the military. But by 1939, he was studying, and so he gets he learns about all of these nasty co-infections in ticks. In ticks, he was showing Beller was showing Traub how a nasty bunch of co-infections in one tick could produce this very complex disease in dogs. And so the list of diseases that he gave were the same diseases that would later be in the American ticks, with the exception of one being Lyme disease. Like he switched out a parasite with the spirochete, basically. And so he also he had a student under him at the time named Werner Schaefer, who would later work with Traub at Insel Reams, and he would be working on bioweapons with him. He retrieved a strain of Borrelia anserina. So this is a bird Lyme disease, and later on we find that it's the closest relative to Borrelia burgdorferi. So it came basically from this Borrelia anserina. In 1939, we have him with the spirochete, and Schaefer saying in the paper that I'm bringing it back to my superiors at the University of Gießen, which were Erich Traub and Carl Beller.
All right, so to get on the higher level, so essentially he's trained here. He was doing it beforehand and then moved to America, trained here, went back to Nazi Germany, joined the Nazi Party. He was doing this research for the Nazis in Germany. Was he doing this on humans at that point, or was it just strictly veterinary lab stuff, normal science?
Yeah, it was, and it was animal disease. They weren't yet doing the human experimentation.
Okay, well, and this becomes, it's very significant difference here. And the reason is, I understand that he came back to the United States after the war as part of Operation Paperclip. But if he was only working in the lab, maybe he wasn't as bad as some of the others, like Carl Blum and other doctors who definitely seem to be tied directly to human experimentation.
Well, he went to a lab called Insel Reams. This is like Germany's Plum Island. He went to that lab. He became the president, or the vice president, rather. I'm sorry. He became vice president of Insel Reams in 1942. And at that time, that's when the human experimentation really started. Like, well, I'm not saying that's when it started, but that's when was really like starting to get rolling. Um, and they had forced labor at Insel Reams.
Okay, so his hands are not clean.
No. Well, he was tied up with a lot of the people that were actually doing a lot of these human experiments. Okay, and they had forced labor, and then in 1945, the Soviet Union took over Insel Reams. They got East Germany. They took over East Germany, and Insel Reams was under East Germany, and they were interrogating the staff about whether or not the incinerator for cremating animals was also used for humans. And I believe it was, because Erich Traub was working on a human influenza vaccine. It was a human/avian influenza vaccine. And I believe they were testing it on people at Insel Reams. And this is and so it seems as though they were able to blackmail Erich Traub to become a double agent. And they, after he did this,
Who blackmailed him? The Soviets?
the Soviet Union, yeah. So Joseph Stalin actually put that facility under his personal protection. It says in the it was like such an important facility that he was specifically concerned about that facility. Like he wanted that facility. That was the leading virology institute in the entire world.
Wow. So Erich Traub is working then under control of Joseph Stalin, but winds up over here as part of Operation Paperclip.
Yep, they facilitated a so-called escape, right? But it was actually done with the help of these Soviet moles in British intelligence, which, you know, Donald McLean, Philby was his handler, Kim Philby.
So he's part of the Cambridge 5 or 4.
Yeah, because Donald McLean was the one who was like helping to get a lot of those paperclip Nazis over here. And Erich Traub was one of those. And so they set him up with this fake escape, brought him over here, and then gave him to us.
Wow. Okay. So Cambridge 5 tied into Operation Paperclip, tied into the Soviet Union. A lot of complexity here.
Yeah, it's pretty complex. And so when we brought Erich Traub over here, now Richard Shope and all of those guys, they knew how intelligent Traub was, and they were, you know, he could run circles around all of these Americans. And so we basically put that guy at the top of our biological warfare program. He was advising us on how to set up the biological warfare program. He was advising us on how to make Plum Island, how to build Plum Island.
Well, let's shift gears now because I did want to get into that.
Sure.
What exactly is Plum Island?
Plum Island is the name for an animal disease center where they study some of the most infectious diseases of livestock. But it's kind of misleading because basically what he was telling them was, you know, you hide all of your biological warfare research under animal disease and defensive work. Right? And that goes into Germany was the whole, like, Germany did that. They became masters of hiding their biological warfare program because of what happened in World War I with the sanctions and everything after they used those kinds of weapons. So Erich Traub was kind of like, you hide it all under animal disease and defensive work, right? And now keep in mind, one of the things Erich Traub was doing was taking animal diseases and turning them into human diseases. It's called adaptation, which, you know, the animal kingdom is a vast reservoir for new human diseases. And it's the whole idea behind zoonosis. But that was something they were focused on doing. And so he advised them to set up this, you know, Plum Island. And they would start doing these tests there. They would start doing these bird tests where he would release ticks on shore birds. He would say they're infected with a harmless simulant, which is a supposed harmless bacteria that's meant to simulate a dangerous bacteria. And that, like, yeah, like, so.
To what end?
So, yeah, it's supposed to be a simulation. So, for example, San Francisco, they sprayed the so-called harmless bacteria all over the city from the bay with these Navy ships, and they were like, okay, we want to see how it spreads out to see how a real bioterror attack would go down. Right?
What could go wrong?
Yeah, right. And so people died from those tests in San Francisco. And started getting really sick, and they were having all these hospital infections after those tests. And the bacteria that they were using was actually a bacteria that Erich Traub had weaponized in 1940. It was called Serratia marcescens. And so he started advising them to do all of these simulant tests. And one of the simulant tests was releasing ticks on shorebirds that were supposed to be infected with these harmless simulant bacteria, but they were all infected with this cocktail of disease. And so he got here in 1949. He started doing all of these tests from Plum Island. He was also he was also traveling down to Colombia in South America for the FAO. So he became a member of the UN before he got over here. The FAO is kind of like the World Health Organization, but it's for agriculture. It stands for Food and Agriculture Organization.
This is from Erich Traub, who was secretly a double agent working for Joseph Stalin at the time.
Yes. And they didn't know it. But so this became part of a tripartite agreement. Like any research that the US did, British would duplicate that and Canada would duplicate that. And then I think at one point Australia even got involved. And so all of this started going down. And Erich Traub was not just this little veterinarian. And so, like I was saying before about animal diseases, the reason that veterinarians are the best bioweaponeers are because of that whole zoonosis thing, and they understand a large number of different immune systems, and this becomes very important with zoonosis and stuff. And animal diseases is their specialty. So he was at pretty much the top of the program, because the Nazis had a very sophisticated program, and most of the books on the Nazi biological warfare program, I do not really get it. Like Insel Reams was doing the leading research in their bioweapons program because of the whole animal disease zoonosis thing. And it wasn't until, I believe, 1951, Donald McLean had defected to Moscow, right? Defected to Moscow, and he left a recording saying that he was a proselytizing communist. He was a communist, and they started to get suspicious. Okay, so after a while, they realized, well, Donald McLean was the one who brought all these Nazis over here. So then they were really scrambling. And at one point, a man named, what was his name? He was a friend of Dan Benjamin, a guy named Dan Benjamin, who John Loftus knew very well, had actually interrogated Erich Traub. Eventually, they started to sift through everything, and they realized, okay, so he interrogated Erich Traub and tripped him up in a lie and got him to confess that he was a Soviet double agent. He was working for Stalin. But he tried to play it off like he was just this small guy, and he was trying to hide out and lay low. And so Dan Benjamin suggested that we prosecute him as a spy and execute him and all that stuff. But the system, or our establishment, our government, decided to accept his phony explanation, and we decided we'd just send him back to Germany. We would fire him from all his work here in America, and we would send him back to Germany. And I think, too, is that because he was a member of the UN, he was almost untouchable due to the diplomatic immunity thing, which is not always like a certainty. Like it's not like they can decide, but usually that diplomatic immunity thing kind of gives them a cover. And so, but when we sent him back to Germany, he was going back to West Germany, which was under the Western powers. they made him the head of another biological weapons facility. And so he was also coming back to America. He would take trips back to America to attend certain virology conferences and things. And he actually visited Plum Island for its opening day ceremony. Like, they invited him there. We were also sending him viruses, dangerous viruses, over in Germany, and he was sending them to us.
Dr. Traub was still working with the US, just now in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now to finish this whole tale out, though, how did he get involved with Lyme disease?
So it was due to those tick tests. With these ticks, so he had, like I was saying, his student had given him the strain where Lyme disease came from. They know that strain, Borrelia anserina, is the closest match to Lyme disease. And also, he learned about all of the same co-infections that would also accompany the cocktail. So he started doing these tests on Plum Island with these birds and these ticks. And like John Loftus says in his book, he says that his sources had told him that this is where it came from, that these birds were carrying it all up and down the eastern seaboard. And so we had this bird program. And birds are reservoirs of Lyme disease now. And so he was going to Columbia, back and forth to New York, Columbia, in parallel with the bird patterns. And so and also another thing that is very important is all the way up to 1946 into 1951, they were saying that the black-legged tick carries no human diseases. There was no they had no problems with it, and that's why they started using the black-legged tick in these tests. They started using that because they're like, okay, it carries no human diseases, so we can use this en masse. They started using that, and it was these tick tests, these simulant tests, right, that were carrying it all over the United States now. These ticks were released, these infected ticks, and we have a source talking about Erich Traub releasing ticks areas. There was a photograph. A source on Plum Island was saying he saw a photograph of Erich Traub pointing to where he released the ticks. It was like part of the program showing, like, just whatever. But then we have, so Polly Murray, she talks about in 1956, she becomes sick for the first time. And there was this whole MS, multiple sclerosis study, where this German guy who had been over here for a while was saying that he was finding spirochetes in these MS patients. And like the quote that John Loftus said in his 1982 Belarus Secret was that they were monitoring Lyme disease secretly under the guise of these New England health studies, sometimes with multiple sclerosis, sometimes with other things, but they were monitoring it for a while. And when John Loftus published his book, it was actually before they had acknowledged it came from ticks. And then the year later, they acknowledged what he said was true about the ticks, that these were spreading Lyme disease.
Now, to clarify in my head, are you saying that Lyme disease is a simulant, but it actually had a payload?
Yeah, he was, from what I was told, is that he was telling them that this will leave a bullseye rash, but it's harmless. And the Nazis were actually doing tests with it to see how far it would spread in Africa. They were doing that in Africa or something. or in Europe, in Eastern Europe as well, I believe. But it was a simulant test gone awry. So he had packed these nasty infections in these ticks, and they would cause a disease that on the outset you look okay, but in the inside you feel awful. And that's basically what we see today. And that's why a lot of people with Lyme disease are referred to psychiatry, because they're being told that they're imagining their disease because the doctors can't find anything wrong with them, right? And so in it wasn't so all these people started to get sick, and we know that from Polly Murray's book, was that she was sick for a long time, long before they had acknowledged it in 1975, right? And so it goes all the way back to the time that Erich Traub was doing all this stuff, and he was the one. So when you really take a look at it, it's like, okay, whoever put this together was a veterinarian. They understood a lot of things. And so this whole immune paralysis or immune tolerance thing, which I like to call immune paralysis, is a major signature of Lyme disease and Erich Traub's life work. It mirrors all of his life work. And a lot of his other weapons, this is what he used, and it has to do with a certain antigen that is on Lyme disease. And an antigen is like the outer surface protein, or on a virus, a spike protein, something that calls forth an immune response. And this is something that kind of throws the immune system into disarray. It kind of forces the immune system into going to sleep. It's not able to do its job. And that's why I called it The Great Imitator Antigens of Biological Warfare in my subtitle, The Rise of Lyme Disease, Chronic Illness, and the Great Imitator Antigens of Biological Warfare. So it's not so much that it's the spirochete doing it, it's these proteins that he added onto it. And so he did this to many of his bioweapons. Like these were his class of bioweapons. He liked to make diseases that would really, like, they wouldn't cause a lot of deaths at first, right? But then when you get a lot of people sick with these diseases, and then the next generations come forth, and then the next ones, you see cancer going way up, you see neurological diseases going way up, and you see the chronic disease. Basically, you see all the stuff that we're seeing today. But it's just like, so there's a lot of things that I looked into, since they won't admit any of this stuff. They won't admit any of these tests. So I had to kind of look into all these different statistics. I had to look at, the fact that they were saying that the black-legged tick doesn't have any human diseases all the way up into 1951. They were saying that, like in the scientific papers and such. But then I have 1956 or something, or maybe it was 1958. I don't know if it was 56 or 58, but I have a newspaper article where they're saying there was an article about ticks, and they named the black-legged tick as a serious transmitter of disease.
Okay, so bring us to now, which is really hard. Where do we go from here? I mean, you're carrying this condition. Many others do. I don't know the exact number of people who have Lyme disease. And there's also that weird tie you're saying with MS, which sounds like a whole nother scary conversation. Are you saying that it could be related?
Yeah. So a lot of times with these Lyme disease infection with the spirochetes, the people who get the really nasty disease, a lot of times that has to do with viruses that reactivated in parallel when the spirochetes. So when the spirochetes start shedding all of these proteins, it causes viruses to reactivate, not unlike those early experiments that Erich Traub was doing in his mice, right? So he injected these foreign proteins into mice, and it shocked their immune system and caused viruses to reactivate. Well, the same thing happens with these spirochetes. And so a lot of times, like Epstein-Barr virus will reactivate in a lot of these people. Like a lot of people will have very high Epstein-Barr virus, the people who have chronic Lyme disease. And that is actually one factor in MS, like these reactivated viruses. But there was that guy who was also finding spirochetes in brain samples or something, or it was cerebral spinal fluid in people with MS. So yes, we are seeing that they may very well be related. Not the only cause, but for some, it is the cause.
Wow. Okay. So normally I ask, what's the one question I should have asked you but didn't? But I think that's probably a list of them
Yeah.
at this point. So I'm just going to.
It's a very
Ask
complex
it.
subject, and I had the extremely difficult task of putting it all into, like, I had a 1,000-page manuscript, and it was very technical, and there was no way I couldn't, because it has to do with a very technical science, and I had to kind of like dumb it down, and I had to get it into a small book. So it's like, it's a very technical, and it's a very complex story as well, with like the Cambridge Five spies and the whole intelligence wars that were playing out. It is a very complex thing.
Well, and complexity is here. The book is The Sleeper Agent, which is a nice coded terminology of a disease that's lying underneath that could be causing problems, or a double agent that is kind of a disease of people. And again, The Sleeper Agent by A.W. Finnegan. Adam, thank you so much. I feel almost overwhelmed, but I deeply, deeply appreciate it.
Yeah, I know, it's hard. It's hard not to. It's just, it's. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on.